Well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, good any time of the day or night, wherever you are. Peace and blessings. And thank you for joining me again with just a little bit of your time. So want to go ahead and touch on a few things from the last chapter, which is controlled language. And this is going to be pretty short. They talked about this being a language that they had to set up for a new life's work, meaning that the way they communicated with the Africans at this time was going to be all geared toward them accomplishing the work that they had stolen them from Africa to do. So, you know, there was a lot going on. They had to do this breaking process and this making of a slave. And now, as it seemed to them that that was not enough, they needed to have something else that would give them more control over the Africans and over their work. And so this was the new life's work. With the controlled language, that's what they were going to do. And I know it talked about, you know, what a controlled language was, you know, teaching them to having a specific language for them and teaching meanings of words that weren't really the meaning of those words. For example, as it said in the book, our crops. There was no our crops, okay? But that was just an example. So it said that language leads to the heart of a people. And brings in foreign culture, okay? So, in other words, the people that were here in America at that time, of course, they spoke a language, and that language that they spoke, they completely understood. They completely understood all the inferences and all of the, you know, definitions of all the words that they used. They were quite familiar with the language, and it was based on their culture. And of course, Africans were not a part of their culture, so they were not a part of their language. So in a sense, that gave them an upper hand, an advantage, because they knew Africans did not know the language. And like I said before, they had to teach Africans the language because that was the only way they could get them to work for them. They had to have some kind of basic understanding of the language. And that part they did, and they did it with a sense of care, so that the Africans would only understand certain things about their language. Now, they could speak their language in front of them and around them all day long as the Africans only had a specific understanding of the language. And they did that, of course, on purpose. Now, and it also said that value systems were embedded in the language, okay? So when they, for example, when they said our crops, there was a certain value in that phrase that was meant for the Africans, with a totally different meaning for the slaves. Okay, and that example they gave us about the hog pen. You know, they said that the hog pen, you can tell it, have an African live in a hog pen. He might ask you for provisions to clean his hog pen, or to partially clean it, or to not clean it at all. But you had to impress upon the African that this hog pen was his hog pen where he was to live. And it was up to him how he kept it, because that was his living space or her living space. And they could keep it however they wanted to keep it because it was their hog pen. And then they said to be very careful with the language, because you have to be mindful not to refer to that hog pen as his house. Now, why was that important? Because if you slipped up and said, oh, man, clean this place up. I can't believe you like living in a house like this. Now, it would only take a little slip up, but that little seed was planted in the mind of the African, and then what? And then he's like, okay, you live in that house over there, right? And I know the comforts that you have in your house. So it would say that the African will begin to equate your house with his house. He'll see the comforts of your house compared to the comforts of his house. And then he would say, well, wait a minute though, you live in a house and I live in a hog pen, but you refer to this hog pen as my house. Then he will begin to try to house. In other words, it's a place that he was supposed to live, as opposed to your house, which was nowhere near and could not in any way be mistaken for a hog pen. Okay, so now he's like, okay. And remember, there was always that little ember. I believe in every African there was that ember that continued to burn inside, that was there in case a slip up like that occurred, that would draw them back to where they were in the beginning, to what, you know, their culture and things. And so because of that, I'm sorry, I'm flipping through some of the notes that I have here. And because of that, little ember, and you said house, and then he would have a memory in his mind, house. You know what? I used to live in a house, or my mother used to live in a house, or my parents lived in a house. And maybe that would begin, cause him to remember that I'm not from here. I mean, my parents aren't here. My parents are where I was before they brought me here. And which would then resurrect his memory of himself living in a house. Okay? And then not a pig pen, but in a house. All right? And then he would determine that it is only right that he live in a house too. And then why? Because then that him living in a house, or him remembering the house that his parents raised him in Africa, would then, start all these other memories and reconnecting to start. And so that's why they said it was very important to be aware and cognizant of the language that you used around the Africans, because they were just that far away. All that had to occur is that they would start remembering, and even maybe that all that they did in this implementation of the making of a slave would very quickly start to unravel, and once it started to unravel, then you had the beginnings of uprisings and insurrections, because who would want to stay in servitude as a slave when they remembered that they came from somewhere much better. When they made that connection and they knew that just, I guess, what they would call Freudian slips of the tongue would cause that it would just automatically spark something in their mind, in their memory, in their spirit that would let them know, oh, wait a minute, something's wrong. And then you have something on your hands that you have to deal with because he remembered that no, he's not a slave. These are not the conditions that he needs to be living in or she needs to be living in, and that he was the equal of the slave owner at least, and maybe even superior. They didn't want that rolling around in the African's head. So that's why they created this new language. Remember, language just, it says, embodies the culture of a people. You know, it connects them. It sets certain values. And if he was to have access and start to understand and be able to communicate in this language, there wouldn't be anything that the opaques could keep from him. He would know everything that he needed to know just in mere conversation. Because remember this, people learn how to communicate with language long before they learn how to read. So he, you know, you have little babies at the age of maybe 2 and sometimes younger that can communicate with words. They can't read. You can see them sometimes they'll pick up the book and start acting like they're reading, you know, pointing at things like that because they're used to you reading to them. But the ability to read comes much, much later. So, you know, even though they outlawed reading, prohibited reading for slaves, it just in case, you know, somebody was allowing their slave to learn how to read or things like that. But he would demand, if he learned these things, the African, he would learn and demand that you respect him as your equal. Now, I talked a little bit, I'll go through this real quick. I talked a little bit about Pops, who lived in Philadelphia, could not read. Pops was 80-some years old when he passed away. And that, when we went to Virginia, that was the first time he had ever left the city of Philadelphia because he was afraid to leave because he couldn't read. And he was afraid of getting out there and getting lost. So you can see, you know, what not reading, how much restriction that put on you. You know, it just made it where you just didn't know, you know, where you are, who you were, or what you needed to do. So traveling outside of Philadelphia was something that he hadn't done up until that time. He could talk, you get a good conversation with him, but he couldn't read. And that would have opened up the door for him to things that he would never know, would never have known unless he learned to read. And then, again, when they said our crops, that meant, our crops meant that you're responsible, you know, for doing the work so that we can have the crops, but you don't have any ownership. The ownership belongs to us. But they said our crops to kind of make a sort of pseudo ownership so that the Africans would get out there and they would do the best job they could do to save the crops and bring them in and things like that. And they also were intelligence. Intelligence has nothing to do with knowing a language or reading, because they obviously created and implemented tools to make their job in planning and harvesting those crops much easier. Okay, so intelligence was never an issue. All right, so I think we're probably at the end of the Willie Lynch letter and the making of a slave. There may be some other things that we can talk about here and there as we go on. I have another book that I want to read and do kind of the same thing with, because we need to know. We need to know. We're not going to lack knowledge if we don't have to lack knowledge. So I just want to say again, thank you so much for joining me. Peace and blessings to you, and always stay woke. Stay woke, y'all. Coffee, whatever it takes. Stay woke. All right. See you next time.